Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. My guest today has a voice that has enthralled audiences in the world's greatest concert halls and opera houses for decades. Jessye Norman is acknowledged as one of the greatest singers of her generation. She's now written a reflective memoir, Stand Up Straight and Sing, about her life in music. She was born in America's segregated South with a talent that transcended barriers. Has her success helped to tear those barriers down? Jessye Norman, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
The briefest way of putting it is that yours is a life that began in the segregated South of the United States during a time of extraordinary troubles and took you all the way to the most gilded opera houses in the world.
Yes.
Did you, through all of that journey, feel that you were defying the odds?
Well, certainly defying the odds, but also very fortunate and very lucky in so many ways. I know that from hearing educators talk about arts and education, that arts education was a part of my public school education in the United States. So we had choirs and bands and dance groups and arts clubs and all the rest of it. And it was there available for every child.
But
Yes.
you, after all, were an African-American child
Yes.
in Georgia, small
Yes.
town of Georgia.
Augusta, Georgia.
Augusta, Georgia. And the prevailing feeling in the South, which of course was ruled by white people, was
Yes.
that blacks should know their place. And their place, frankly, was not in the concert hall or the opera house.
Yes, but you see, that wasn't my thought. And that certainly was not the thought of my parents or the people that were around me, the other people that were nurturing me, whether they were my family members or people from my community or from my school and my church. And when I was able to see the wonderful film of Marian Anderson at about age 10 or 11, the woman, it was called The Lady from Philadelphia, with this woman standing there in all of her majesty and her grace, African-American, looking very much like me.
African-American, but a woman who had the most marvelous voice, but was
Yes.
not allowed to perform in America's finest opera houses.
Not until 1955. You're quite right about that. But she was performing everywhere else. She was performing for the monarchs of Europe and being asked by someone like Queen Victoria to have an intimate and personal meeting, not just to hear Marian Anderson sing, but to understand Marian Anderson the person. That was something that was very inspirational to me.
You also were quite a political young woman.
Oh, yes.
You were a member of the NAACP.
The youth
you went
chapter.
on marches, and I think you were even involved in sit-in protests. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So in a way, it's odd that you ended up going into an art form which was perhaps the least contemporary, the least connected to what was unfolding in America
Yes,
at the time.
Precisely.
Why did you do that?
It's important to understand that arts education, having a music teacher at age 5 or 6 that tells you about the great violinists of the world, the great orchestras of the world, and plays this music for you to hear. This gives you space to dream. And whereas you might, as I certainly was, living in the segregated South, where you were certainly living in an oppressive situation, the oppression was not in my mind. It was not in my spirit. It was something that was happening outside of me. My parents were very involved in the civil rights movement, as was my older brother, who was the chairman of the youth chapter for the NAACP when he was in college in Augusta, Georgia, at Payne College. But my thoughts about what my life could be were certainly not limited to what the circumstances of my life
I mean, I just
were.
wonder when you went into those restaurants which were segregated,
Yes.
and you and your friends made a point of sitting in places you shouldn't be sitting.
Absolutely.
Did you ever come close to hating white people and the white power that oppressed you?
No, because you see, I'm still, even at this ripe age, I'm still that 5-year-old in the train station with my parents on our way from Augusta to Philadelphia to visit our relatives and friends there, and going over to the white section, as it were, of the train station sitting area and saying to my mother, "See, Mommy, nothing happens when I sit over here." Because I always thought the segregation was stupid and foolish and useless. And even at age 5, I thought that. And certainly a few years later, after age 5, I have the same idea about it.
A final point about this youth you had.
Yes.
It just seems to me, we're talking about the 50s and then into the 60s.
Yes.
You know, there was a huge sort of musical input to the black community, from jazz to blues to then rock and roll.
Of course.
Were you and you were a very musical young woman.
Yes.
Were you, in a way, drawn to them because then you could have expressed your politics much more easily than you could in opera?
Well, I'm not sure that's absolutely true. Because you see, I think that one has to understand one's own gifts. And I understood from listening to my contemporaries, and certainly listening to people that were professional in these genres, that I didn't possess the gospel singing kind of voice. And I wasn't particularly interested in sort of singing pop music. The songs that I sang, I learned at school, or I learned at church, or I learned sort of sitting next to my mother at the piano in our house. And so this wasn't pop music that I was learning. So therefore, that isn't what I was singing. In another circumstance, perhaps with different parents, or in a different situation, I might have been drawn to a different kind of different genre of music. But as it was, I spent my Saturday afternoons listening to the Metropolitan Opera on the radio on Saturday, not having any idea that it was something that I should not understand, or that it was something that was too complicated for me to understand. It wasn't hard at all. There was this wonderful announcer, Milton Cross, who told you what everything looked like, what everybody was wearing, that Joan Sutherland was very tall and wearing a beautiful blonde wig, and told us what was happening in the story. So as far as I was concerned, opera was simply grown-up sort of versions of sort of children's stories.
But when we get to you going through the training,
yes,
and you went to, I think, conservatory, was it Howard University in Washington, D.C.,
yes,
then
the
Michigan.
Peabody Conservatory, and then Michigan.
Michigan as well.
Yes.
And to learn the technicalities of singing opera
yes,
is quite something. But I just
yes,
wonder whether you, looking back on it, can say, you know, without false modesty, that you always had this extraordinary range, this amazing voice, or was it trained into you?
It was certainly, I think, a combination of many things. As a young child, I could always sing very loudly. I remember being about 7 years old and invited by my then second grade teacher to sing for the weekly gathering of all of the 1,200 students in the school. And she said, "We'll have you sing by yourself because we won't need to move the microphone up and down. We won't have to, you can sing without the microphone, so the principal of the school can keep the microphone at his height." And I took it as a compliment. I wasn't at all embarrassed or thinking, "Oh, gee whiz, I sing too loudly." So I always had a voice of a certain strength and a certain volume. That was certainly something that I could do very easily.
But you also have the range.
And
you
the
can
range,
go
yes,
from the highest of the high to, you know, I think for most female singers, extraordinary lows.
But at the same time, as a child in the choir at the school, I sang whatever part was missing. So if we didn't have very strong sopranos in the choir at age sort of 7 or 8, then I would sing with the sopranos. Of course, there becomes a certain time at about 10 or 11 when it's almost, you practically have to sort of, I don't know, sort of bribe the boys to stay in the choir. So we didn't have a lot of tenors. So I'd sing with the tenors. And then there came a later time still, sort of 13 or 14, when truly there were no boys in the choir practically. So I would sing with the basses. So without knowing it and without thinking about it in that way, I was training my voice to sing in these different registers without really thinking about it, simply singing what was needed.
Well, I tell you what, I think now is the ideal time just to give us all a little flavour of this extraordinary voice. This is much more contemporary. This is only sort of 6 years ago, but let's just hear that voice in full flow doing Wagner. how do you manage to get inside the parts and the meaning in so many different languages?
I'm able to get inside the parts and the meanings, the nuance of the language of the music, because you see, I don't sing in a language that I do not speak.
All of these languages you have become fluent in?
Fluent more so in some than others, but I don't sing in a language that I have not studied as a language, because I understand that singers, as I write in my book, we have another level of responsibility. We have words, and those words should be understood. It should be possible for the audience to sit and listen to us singing in Italian or in the French or in German, and without knowing the text, they should be able to gather what is happening in that particular piece.
And to what extent in a performance like that is it about the physicality of the acting, the performance on stage,
Yes.
as well as the purity and quality of the
yes.
voice?
It is important. All of it is important. One can't just stand there like a bump on a log and sing. That can be very beautiful for some people. But the rest of us need to be able to act as well. And that is what engages the audience. When they know that you are as committed to what you're singing, as committed to portraying that character as you are to delivering your gift, your voice.
Do women, when it comes to this aspect of opera in particular, do they get judged in a way that men do not?
But of course. I mean, we've heard countless stories, certainly very recently, about a designer designing a dress for a performance without ever having seen the person that is going to sing the performance. And therefore choosing rather to have someone that's going to fit into the costume rather than someone who's going to be able to sort of actually sing the role. And that is something that is so misguided.
You mean casting directors now for female parts are prioritizing the look and the appearance more than the quality of the voice?
Very often. I wouldn't say always. Thank goodness that is not true always. But it certainly happens enough that it makes the papers, as it were.
Talking of making the papers, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a big furore in this country recently when a young and talented Irish female opera singer was criticized for her performance in Rosenkavalier. And the basis of it was that, and these are quotes from some of the newspapers, she was a chubby bundle of puppy fat. She was stocky. She was dumpy. Physically, she didn't work in the role.
What do you mean she didn't work in the role? Do you mean she didn't sort of look good in the dress, which could have been designed for her and could have been made to look good? Anybody can look good in anything.
I just wonder, I suppose my point is, and this did create a huge storm inside the opera
world. That is personal and unpleasant.
Yeah, I mean, one reaction from Alice Coote, who's a mezzo-soprano of some standing, she said, you know, if we start to judge performance on appearance like this, it will be the death of opera. She said opera is all about the voice. But you're saying something slightly different.
I'm saying that it's about the voice, but it's also about suspending belief. You need to be able to look and listen and understand the portrayal of a character and not assume that the person that is in that dress has to sort of look like the 16-year-old that might be singing Salome, or a person of a certain age that might be singing Rosenkavalier. Who's decided that the person singing Rosenkavalier should wear a size 0 dress? Who's decided that? Except the person who's designed the costume without seeing the person that is going to wear the costume. Because I promise you, anybody, it doesn't matter what the shape is, what the size is, can be designed, be given a costume that is designed to flatter that body. And unless designers are willing to do that, then perhaps they should work in other fields.
Yes. One of the critics who was criticized for his own criticism of the Irish singer, he fought back and he said this. He said, opera is a visual as well as an oral experience. It's a form of theatre. It is 75% about the voice, 25% about the ability to act well.
And who is he to decide that, please? Or she? Who is he to decide that something is 75% voice and 25% something else? Why isn't it 40, 60%?
Did the critics infuriate you throughout your career? I just wonder how you respond, to critics who take a stand on something that you've worked so hard on, that is, so much an expression of your personality, and then they feel free to write this sort of stuff.
Well, they might write it, but darling, I don't read it. I don't need it. I know whether or not I have done on stage what I intended to do that night, that evening, that afternoon. So whatever I am able to do, I am giving all of that I'm able to do on that particular night. And if it doesn't suit somebody who is sitting there not having paid for their ticket to be there, and they find it not to their liking, what does it matter? Who are they? They're not my friends. They're not from my family. They're not people who work with me or coach me or have been in any way influential in my life. So why should it matter what that person says?
A different aspect of the world that you chose to work in, classical music and opera, is, some would argue, snobbery. A snobbery about the art form being higher than other musical forms.
And I don't believe in that. I truly don't believe in that. I say so often and with such joy exactly what the Duke Ellington said about music years ago, that there are only two kinds of music: good music and music that isn't. And some of that good music was written by Beethoven, and some of that good music was written by George Gershwin.
Let's hear you sing a little bit of George Gershwin.
Okay.
It's very clear our love is here to stay, not for a year, but ever and a day.
Another beautiful sound, and it brings to my mind something you said a while ago about this mixing of genres. You said pigeonholes are only interesting to pigeons.
Yes, precisely.
But if I push you, if you are really honest, would you say that you actually get more pure pleasure out of singing and listening to Gershwin than a lot of the opera you do?
I wouldn't be able to say that. Is there anything in the world that is more beautiful than the second act duet of Tristan and Isolde? Is there anything truly more beautiful than Dido and Aeneas in Les Troyens in about the third act of the Siege of Carthage? Is there anything more beautiful than Dido's lament of Henry Purcell at the end of an opera that lasts about an hour? Is there anything more beautiful?
I'm going to stop you because we
yes,
probably could spend 10 minutes with the parts. The point is, you have played all of those parts over decades.
Yes.
But you do love different genres. And I'm just wondering whether there's a little part of you that, looking at modern music and the creativity that comes out of things like hip-hop, might just be interested in challenging yourself one more time with a different genre.
As I have not limited myself to one genre, I've always been interested in all that is going on. I've never tried hip-hop. I never thought that was sort of quite sort of the hip-hop type. But perhaps.
But you know what? Music producers today love mixing genres, and they love sampling and playing with music.
Of course.
If somebody approached you, would you consider it?
I would certainly try it. Why not? I'm sure that I would enjoy it. I've spoken a lot to, as I call it, the kids that sing the hip-hop music, because I know that they need to express themselves. There are things that they need to say. They need to make social and political statements, and they're able to do this through their music.
You've sung at inaugurations, from Republican Ronald Reagan to the inauguration of Democrat Bill Clinton. Are you a political person today?
Absolutely. A political animal in every sense.
And when we talked about the race issue, do you feel that in America today, that the country has moved beyond race, or is it still absolutely front and center of the black experience?
It is still front and center of the American experience. We don't really allow ourselves in the United States to have a real, honest, open conversation, as is so needed, and not just in America, but all over the world, about racism. And it is something that we simply have to do. It isn't something about which we can ignore the subject matter. We have to talk. We have to try to understand one another. We have to understand that there are certain cultural differences. If we could understand that we all started from the same basin, that we all started from the same seed.
Yeah, I mean, that is undoubtedly true, but it doesn't mean that when you, for example, look out at an orchestra during a performance, you're going to see a representation that reflects the demographic of the city where you might happen to be.
Very often.
Frankly, wherever you are, there can be many more white players than black players. And I wonder how you believe, with all your experience in the industry, that can change.
I am working to change that. And I'm working to change that with the New York Philharmonic, particularly in New York. That we will find players that have the ability, perhaps not having had the experience, but certainly have the ability to people these orchestras.
But you're almost suggesting positive discrimination.
No, I'm not.
Can that work in an art form?
No, that isn't the way it works at all. When you are auditioning for an orchestra, you audition behind a curtain.
Right.
So a person doesn't know your sex, a person doesn't know what you look like, a person doesn't know that your father perhaps plays in the orchestra as well, because that simply isn't the way that it can be done and to be done democratically. What we have to see to happening is that everybody that is able to be there and is invited. And that has to do with the general director and the artistic advisors of a particular orchestra, of an opera house, deciding that this is something that we have to do. We simply can't keep going to the same river expecting that we're going to get a different result. We have to widen our expanse, and we have to widen our choice, and to make sure that we're making certain that everybody that could possibly be at a level that would be required for playing in a symphony orchestra is there auditioning to play in that symphony orchestra.
And we've discussed this in the context of race, but there is also a gender issue. I think you said that you have only played and performed in front of 2 female conductors. Is that really true?
It's absolutely true. It is absolute nonsense. Jane Glover, who's English, and Rachel Warby, who's American. It is absurd, but it is true. We have to understand that the other half of the population, women, deserve to be treated in a much different way. Can you imagine that still in the Congress of the United States we're debating whether or not women should be paid the same amount of money as men for doing the same job? That still in the United States a woman is paid very often in a corporation 77 cents in the dollar that a man is paid for the very same job. This, of course, is a nonsense, absolute nonsense.
Well, I asked you if you had politics in you, and you clearly do, but we have run out of time.
Have we run out of time? Oh gosh, I was just getting warmed up.
I just have to thank you very much for being on HARDtalk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.